Now, every now and again, something happens that is so momentous and so big that everyone can remember exactly where they were when it happened or when they heard about it happening. So 9/11, for example, I can remember where I was and what I was doing when I heard about the terrorists hijacking those passenger planes and flying two of them into the Twin Towers and one of them into the Pentagon and then the fourth towards Washington. And of course, 9/11 and the events that happened on 9/11 has had a massive impact on the world. It has changed the world to some extent. We still feel its effects. Now, what I would love to be able to do this morning, but for obvious reasons can't, I would love to be able to invite some special guests up onto the stage, the Apostle Peter and James and John and the disciples of Jesus, and I'd love to be able to ask them what they remember about that resurrection day, that Sunday, the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And I'd love to be able to ask them how it made them understand certain things and see certain things that they'd never really seen before and what life was like for them afterwards. Because that Easter weekend, it wasn't just the most significant and momentous event or weekend in the whole history of mankind. That resurrection morning, it signaled the dawning of a new world. A new age had begun. A new creation had been born. A new covenant had been made and had been signed and sealed in the blood of the Lord Jesus. And I'd love to hear the excitement, the freshness of their excitement in their voices, the sense of awe and wonder at the magnitude of what had just taken place, and listening to them describe how they slowly began to understand what had happened and its implications. The wonderful joy that the early church felt in that first century as the decades began to unfold, as they began to meet together to worship the risen Christ on what very quickly became known as the Lord's Day, picking up the Apostle John's phrase in Revelation 1 on the Sunday. Because the cross and the resurrection, it has changed the way that we view the fourth commandment. It's changed it. The very fact that we're here on a Sunday and not on the Sabbath on a Saturday is proof of that. Now, when we looked at the first commandment, we said that despite people's preoccupation with the fourth commandment, it's the first commandment that is the biggest. And it's the first commandment that is the most important, that it's that one on which all the other commandments are built on. And that if you get your focus right on the first commandment, then all the other commandments will fall into place. And that's absolutely true. And yet there is a sense in which the fourth commandment is the biggest commandment. So for example, as you look at it, you'll see that it's the longest commandment. And more ink is spilt over this commandment than the rest. It's referred to in the Old Testament more times than any other of the 10 commandments. The Sabbath day, the fourth commandment, was the sign of this Mosaic covenant. So you remember when God made a covenant with Noah that he wouldn't flood the world again like he had. He gave a covenant sign which was the rainbow. And when God made a covenant with Abraham, he gave a covenant sign which was circumcision. And the Sabbath and the Sabbath day, we find in Exodus 31, is the sign of this covenant that God was making with Moses and God's people. And there you find in Exodus 31, it's very interesting, as God gives the 2 stone tablets to Moses with the 10 commandments engraved on them, he says to Moses, above all, you shall keep my Sabbaths. Perhaps more than all the other commandments, Israel's attitude towards the Sabbath day exposed whether or not God was first in their life. And we find in 2 Chronicles 36 and Jeremiah 17 that Israel's failure to keep the fourth commandment and to keep the Sabbath day holy to the Lord was linked to God eventually expelling his people from the promised land. Now, of course, the Sabbath theme and Sabbath day. It's a massive subject that runs right through the whole Bible. And however you understand it applying today, it's not always as straightforward as we would like it to be. So that means that this morning we can't cover everything. And yet as we do look at verses 8 to 11 and this fourth commandment, we see first of all that this Sabbath day was a gift from God. So that's our first heading, the gift of God. This fourth commandment is only one of two in the 10 commandments that doesn't begin negatively. So as you skim your eyes through the commandments, you'll notice that this commandment doesn't begin with a you shall not. Rather, it begins with a remember. Now, that's partly because it was to be a regular part of their weeks and their lives. They were to remember every week. They were to ensure that they set apart the Sabbath day, the Saturday, every week. It also begins with the word remember because the Sabbath day didn't originate here. So, for example, if you look in Exodus 16, you will see that they are already keeping the Sabbath day, or a Sabbath day is kept there. The Sabbath day was already in existence, and you will see in verse 11 that it dates back to and was given all the way back as a gift in creation. It's a command that is expressed very positively. So you see there in verse 11 that God blesses the seventh day, the Sabbath day. That's also what he did at creation. Blessing here carries the idea of benefit. So the Sabbath day for Israel was to be a good day. It was to be a special day. It was to be a happy day. It was to be a beneficial day. You see here it was to be a different day. You see there in verse 8 that God says that it was to be kept holy. You see there in verse 11 that God says that he'd made it holy. We read of him doing that in the creation account. So it was to be a day in the week that was set apart and different from the other 6 days. So as Israel were a distinct and a set-apart people for God, so they were to have a day that was distinct and set apart for God from the other 6 days. And you see in verses 9 and 10 that one of the things that made it very different from the other 6 days was that they weren't to do any of their normal work on the Sabbath day. How blessed and happy and beneficial was that for them? Now, you remember how Jesus would say in the Gospels that Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was given for their benefit and their blessing. So, for example, the student in Old Testament Israel wasn't to study or revise on the Sabbath day. The employee in Old Testament Israel wasn't to go out into the fields or into the warehouse or into the office on the Sabbath day. The Sabbath was a gift from the Lord. It was to be a day of rest, of stopping, of ceasing. That's what the word Sabbath means. It means to cease. It means to stop. And instead of it being constricting and limiting, it was a day given that was to be looked forward to, especially when you consider the way in which they'd been treated in the past. Look at verse 2. The introduction to this is important. Remember their background. Israel had been slaves in Egypt. They had been ruled over by a cruel king. They'd had these harsh taskmasters that had forced them to carry out unrelenting and unending back-breaking work. And here is their loving and kind Savior God, and he's saying to them, you weren't designed to function like that. He's saying, I don't want you to suffer like that. I want you to enjoy refreshment and rest. You notice that he doesn't say that you shouldn't do any work at all. No, God views work very positively. These verses explicitly point back to God's work in creation. God is the ultimate worker. It alludes back also to Adam's work in the Garden of Eden. Work itself is good. Work was a gift given at creation. 6 days you shall work, God says, but on the 7th day, at the end of the week, on the Saturday, I want you to have a rest. I love you, and I want you to stop. I want you to be freed from the normal pressures of working life. And you see in verse 10 that this was to be for everyone in the Israelite household. So even the servants could have a day off. Even the servants wouldn't have to serve. Even the foreigner or the traveler would be included, the guest. Even the working animals wouldn't have to work. How amazingly compassionate and kind is God? So you look in chapter 23 and verse 12, and it's very moving how it's described there. God says that on the seventh day you shall rest so that even your ox and donkey may be refreshed. And of course, we see there in verse 11, as we said, that this pattern, it doesn't originate in the law. It goes all the way back to creation, where God designed time to work in 7-day weeks. And of course, he designed time to be like that by creating the world in 6 days and then resting on the seventh day, setting apart and blessing and sanctifying the seventh day. Genesis 2, verses 1 to 3, a day on which God himself rested. And as Exodus 31, verse 17 so beautifully puts it, was refreshed. And not because God was tired and worn out, but because he was so satisfied with his work. And this is the pattern that he calls his people to here. And it was already given in creation before the law. And the principle behind it applies to us today. The principle behind it applies to us today. We were not designed to work 7-day weeks. We were not designed to work 7-day weeks. Even before the fall, Adam and Eve had still been given this rest day. And I suspect that some, not all, but some of the mental struggles and stresses that you see in society around you are due to the very fact that society ignores their loving Maker's design for them. Because they're not having this 1 in 7 rest day that God designed for us to have. And yet, as we think about the Sabbath being enshrined in this old covenant law for Israel, it's important to understand that behind it, God is not just talking about the action of rest. He's not just talking about the action of rest. So he's not just saying, just take some time off, just have a break, stop your revision or stop your everyday work. No, God is talking about an attitude of rest. He's talking about an attitude of rest, of resting in him. You see, it's possible, isn't it, to take time out and to rest, but actually in your mind you're not really resting, or in your heart you're not really resting. So, for example, for the Old Testament Jew, not working on the Sabbath, not going out into the fields, required faith that God would provide. For you, not working 1 day in 7 will require faith that God will provide, that he will provide enough income for you, that you'll still be able to pass your exams even though you're having this time out this day where you're not doing any revision. It requires trust, a trust that God knows what's best for you. A trust that God will provide for you. It also requires you to understand who you are. It requires you to understand your identity. You see there in verse 11, by pointing us back to God's creation work over those 6 days and the rest on the seventh day because the work had been completed, God is reminding us that we are not the creator of this world. We're not the sustainer. We're not the one who keeps this world going. So this means us understanding that if we write out our to-do list and we don't get everything done on our to-do list, the world will not fall apart. It also means us understanding that if for some reason we were completely taken out of the picture, guess what would happen to this world? Absolutely nothing. The world would not even notice you're gone, because you are not the world's creator. You are not the world's sustainer. You are not the one who keeps this world going. And you can have rest in that. And you can enjoy a day of rest knowing that the world is in good hands and will carry on as you take time out. Secondly, we have the good works and glory of God. Good works and glory of God. You remember in the New Testament, Jesus repeatedly comes under fire for healing on the Sabbath. And you remember how he responds? He responds to his opponents by asking them whether it's lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath. And the reason why he asked them that is because if there was ever a day to do the best works, the ultimately good works, it was on the Sabbath, because God had given the Sabbath day to especially remember his good works. We saw it in that Sabbath day song that they would have sung on the Sabbath in the Old Testament, didn't we? Psalm 92. For you, O Lord, have made me glad by your work. At the works of your hands, I sing for joy. I wonder, when someone this morning, when you came here, asked you how your week's been, how many of you said, it's just been really busy? And you started to list out one or two or lots of the works that you have been doing. Or I wonder for how many of us that is a kind of a general response. We just say, it's been really busy, and we start telling them all the different things that we've been doing. We're so obsessed, aren't we, by these tiny, pathetic little works that we do, that we think are so important. And yet here we are told that God has given this day to us, day to Israel, to focus and to remember his magnificent works. For us to have our eyes drawn away from ourselves and to him. You see here in verses 8 to 11 that it's his works of creation that are especially in mind. By tying the day into the creation pattern in this law, it ensures that every single Sabbath day, God's magnificent work of creation was to be remembered. That as God had rested on that first Sabbath day in satisfaction for what God had done, so Israel was to spend time each Sabbath day in amazed celebration and appreciation at all that God had created. And how God had simply said, let there be, and there was. And let there be light, and there was light. How he spoke into being the stars and the mountains and the oceans, the African elephant, the soaring eagle, the leaping salmon. In Exodus 31, God, he says that the Sabbath was to be a sign between him and his people, that he created the world. So every Sabbath day was a reminder to them of it. And every Sabbath day, they were witnessing to the world that God had made it. In Deuteronomy 5, when the law is given again, this time it's the work of God in saving them from Egypt that they were to remember each Sabbath. Let me read verse 15 for you. God says, you shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day. You see, every Sabbath was to be a reminder that God had saved them. That in his might and power and through his grace and his love, God had set them free from their slavery. The great plagues in Egypt. The blood of the lamb on the doorposts, the miraculous dividing of the Red Sea, the pillar of cloud by day and fire by night, the wonderful overthrow of the chariots and the armies of Pharaoh. And yet, of course, ultimately the Sabbath day was given not just to remember God's good works, but to remember God himself. In Ezekiel 20, God says that he gave them the Sabbath day that they might remember who had set them apart in the first place. So every Sabbath day was a day to remember him. to have their minds and hearts drawn back to him, to remember the loving relationship that he had called them into with himself. In 1997 in Frankfurt in Germany, a man reported to the police that his car had been stolen. And 20 years later, the police managed to track it down. And they found that it was exactly where the man had left it. So he'd parked it, he'd gone off, he'd come back to where he thought he'd parked it, and it wasn't there. And so he just assumed that it'd been stolen. But what had happened was he'd just forgotten where he'd left it. And he'd forgotten for 20 years. And you laugh at that, but you've done pretty much the same thing, haven't you? Maybe not for 20 years, but you've parked your car, you've gone off, and you've come back and you can't find where it is because you've forgotten where you've parked it. Or perhaps another example, you've gone upstairs to do something and you've got to the top of the stairs and you can't remember why you've gone upstairs. And you know the only way in which you can find out what you went upstairs for in the first place is to come back downstairs. Or you've had the situation where you've met someone for the first time and you've asked them their name and they've told you, and within 2 seconds you've forgotten it. And for the rest of the conversation, you're not concentrating on what they're saying. You're trying to recall their name because it's got very embarrassing. You see, the point I'm trying to make is your memory is rubbish. Your memory is useless. And it's crucial to understand that the Bible makes absolutely plain that even more so spiritually, your memory is terrible. Your memory is terrible. Situations come at you thick and fast, and your knowledge and truth about God, it just goes out the window. You see, that's why Jesus was so loving when he gave us this meal, that we could remember his death until he comes. That's why Peter in 2 Peter 1 says that he always intends to remind his readers of what they already know. That's why in part God gives his Old Testament people this Sabbath day command. And it's true for us, isn't it? We so easily forget. We forget his grace. We forget his love. We forget his forgiveness. We forget his care. We forget his holiness. We forget his justice. We forget his goodness. We forget his righteousness. We forget his power. We forget his character. We forget his promises. We forget his faithfulness. We forget his calling. We forget his mission. We forget his plans. We forget his works. We forget his commands. We forget Jesus' cross. We forget his glorious resurrection. We forget the fact that Jesus is on the throne and he's king and he's in control. We forget the wonderful hope that we have, that one day Jesus is coming back and we look forward to a new heavens and a new earth. We forget to say thank you to God. We forget to say sorry to God. We forget to pray to God. When we do pray, we don't see his answers because we've forgotten what we prayed for. And you know, one of the main reasons why it's so important that we come together on the Lord's Day is to remember. And this is what we're doing this morning, to remember God, to remember his truth, to be reminded of him and of all of his good works. You need this. Hebrews 10 verses 24 and 25 tell us we grow spiritually cold if we don't. And of course, at the heart of the Sabbath day was the glory of God. You see there in verse 10 that God says it was to be a Sabbath to the Lord. You see, the Sabbath day was to orient itself not around them, but around him. To enjoy him, to glory in him, to delight in him, to glorify him, to make much of him. In Isaiah 58, we find that Israel was no longer delighting in the Sabbaths, and the reason why they're no longer delighting in the Sabbaths, and God gives this reason, is because they're no longer delighting in him. You see, this is what remembering is about as we meet together. It's about being stirred up by the truth that we know about God so that we worship and we delight in and we glory in him. You find it spelled out in Leviticus 23. It was to be a day when Israel was to come together to glory in the Lord. You see it in the Gospels. Israelites, Jesus going to the local synagogue to worship. If you lived in Jerusalem, you would have gone to the temple. Inside the temple were hundreds and hundreds of engravings of flowers and trees. The purpose of its design being to take the Israelites back in their mind to the Garden of Eden, to where Adam and Eve would have worshipped and spent time with God, delighting in him and glorying in him, especially on this Sabbath day. And that's what, in God's grace, the Sabbath was supposed to be like for the people of Israel, a mini Garden of Eden in their week, where they could spend time with the Lord, where labor would stop and work would cease, and they could make the most of this gift that God had given to them to glory in their Maker. You see, that's why this fourth commandment was such a litmus test as to whether they were keeping the first commandment. And I suspect that the way in which we think about the opportunities that God gives us today to meet together and to make the most of the Lord's day is a bit of a litmus test of where our hearts are at in relation to the Lord. And so we finish with the empty grave of Jesus. The empty grave of Jesus. As we come into the Gospels, we find that Jesus always kept the fourth commandment. He did strip away the legalistic rule-keeping and the man-made traditions that have sprung up round the fourth commandment, but he always kept the Sabbath. And yet you notice what happens at the end of Matthew 11 and at the beginning of Matthew 12. You see, in the Old Testament, the law was often portrayed as a place of rest. The law was often portrayed as a place of rest. So, for example, in Jeremiah 6 and verse 16, Israel, they're told to go back to the old paths, to go back to the law, because they're told there, and this is the exact phrase, there they would find rest for their souls. They go back to the law, they will find rest for their souls. And yet what you find Jesus doing at the end of Matthew 11 is instead of telling people to go to the law, he tells people to come to him. He says, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart." And the exact phrase, "you will find rest for your souls." And then immediately after, at the beginning of Matthew 12, you have a Sabbath day event, a Sabbath day encounter where Jesus is explaining the heart of the Sabbath, the spirit of the Sabbath, and he announces that he's the Lord of the Sabbath. He's over the Sabbath. He's king of the Sabbath. He gave the Sabbath. You see, Jesus is not just teaching there at the end of Matthew 11 that if you learn from him, you will find rest for your souls. He's teaching that the Sabbath day pointed forward to him. He is the Sabbath. Hebrews 4 tells us this. It is in Jesus that you will find rest for your souls. It is in Jesus that you will find the forgiveness for all your sins. Trying to get right with God through your work ceases because Jesus has finished his work at the cross. You see, that's why I'd love to be able to invite the apostles Peter and James and John and the disciples of Jesus up onto the stage, because that Resurrection Sunday, it was the dawning of a new age. A new world had come. You see, the Sabbath celebrated the old creation, and it was the sign of the old covenant. And yet that resurrection morning, that resurrection day, it spoke of a new creation coming into being and of a new covenant signed and sealed in the blood of the Lord Jesus Christ. And you get those hints, don't you, as the New Testament unfolds, that the Sunday has taken on a new significance. So in all the Gospels, the resurrection is said to have happened on the first day of the week, or more literally on the one of the Sabbath. And what you find in Acts 20 in verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 16 in verse 2 is that the early church, they met together to worship on the first day of the week. You think of how John in Revelation 1 and verse 10 is spoken of being in the spirit, of worshiping the Lord on the Lord's day. And if you know anything about very early church history, you will know that it's certain that what is being referred to there is the Sunday. It's the resurrection day. Ignatius of Antioch, he was a Christian who died around 108 AD, so he very shortly after the Apostle John, maybe only a decade after the Apostle John died. And this is what he wrote about the Sunday. And he's picking up on John's phrase in Revelation 1. He said that Christians no longer observe Sabbaths, but fashion their lives after the Lord's day, on which our life also arose through him. You read the way in which Paul in Colossians 2 writes about not judging people in terms of their Sabbath keeping, and I think he's very clearly talking about the weekly Sabbath. It shows that the Saturday Sabbath was no longer a binding holy day. It also shows that observing the Lord's Day, the Sunday, can't be an exact replacement for the Sabbath either, with exactly the same rules or expectations. And so therefore we need to be careful about the judgments we make when we see someone observing the Lord's Day or the Sunday in a way that is slightly different to us. A church history tells us that by and large, the early church rested prayerfully on the Sabbath day. They had to work on the Sunday because that was the pattern of normal national life. But before work and or after work, they would meet together to worship with believers. And it wasn't until Constantine brought in a civil law for the Roman Empire in the 4th century which made the Sunday a work-free day. And when that happened, churches strongly welcomed this and encouraged believers to observe and to make the most of this Lord's Day and use it for him and to worship him. And so as we find our rest in the one who fulfills the Sabbath, as we find our rest in Jesus, and yet as we are in this place where there is still a rest to come, Hebrews 4 tells us, surely the spirit and the principles behind the 4th commandment still remain for us today. In fact, like all the other commandments, surely that it's now seen in a new light and in increased depths and in more beautiful colors as we see it through the finished work of Christ, through his cross and his resurrection. And I want to finish by asking some questions. As we no longer look forward, as we no longer look back to the Garden of Eden, but we look forward to the new garden in Revelation 22, where we will see his face and where we will be with him forever. As we look forward to that garden, I want to ask you, why would you not want to make the most of this mini garden each week called the Lord's Day? This mini garden where you can stop from your work and stop from what you're doing and come and spend time with Jesus and his people. Where, like John in Revelation 1, you can come and be in the Spirit on the Lord's Day and spend time with him. Why would you not want to make the most of this day and use it for him? To me, it just doesn't make sense. You imagine a bride Who doesn't want to make the most of an opportunity to spend time with a bridegroom? Imagine a child, and he doesn't want to make the most of an opportunity to spend time with his father. Imagine a brother or a sister, and they don't want to make the most of an opportunity to spend time with their family. What an opportunity the Lord's Day gives to us to meet with God's people and to serve him and to make the most of it for him, to remember him, to remind ourselves of who he is and what he's done, to glorify him and to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus and all that Jesus has done.